Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is episode 2 of my series on the Mexican Revolution, the struggle of a microbe against an elephant. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Porfiro Diaz had fought with Benito Juarez against the French during the French intervention in Mexico, but then seized power in 1876. A careful mix of repression and negotiation with power brokers in various states enabled him to gradually solidify control of Mexico. Hoping to modernize the Mexican economy, Diaz permitted foreign companies to invest in Mexican railroads, mines, and oil production, but they soon dominated those industries. In particular, American investment flooded over the border, while Mexico prospered greatly under Diaz's economic reforms. The vast majority of Mexicans did not share that prosperity. By the turn of the century, 91% were poor, 8% were middle class, and 1% were rich. A generation had grown up in stability and was grateful, but the majority of the population was poor and illiterate with no hope of a better life for their children. Elections were held, but rival candidates were not permitted, so Diaz won re-election again and again. There were few calls for a revolution, but Diaz's position was less secure by 1910. The spark that started the revolution was an interview with American journalist James Creelman in 1908, where Diaz claimed that he would not run in the 1910 presidential election, which would have been his 7th re-election. Intended to improve Diaz's image abroad, he had no intention of keeping the promise. While Diaz was undoubtedly comfortable in the presidential chair, there was another factor behind his reluctance to retire. He had refused to pick a successor largely because he feared assassination once he made the choice. As he grew older, factions formed around potential successors. The main candidates, General Bernardo Reyes and José Yves Limantour, each represented different factions in the government. Limantour led the Cientificos, who followed the philosophy of positivism and believed that scientific methods could be applied to politics. While they favored European investment to counterbalance American influence in the Mexican economy, the Cientificos were wildly unpopular because they were viewed as having persuaded Diaz to implement reforms that had benefited them at the cost of the rest of society. Having led campaigns against the Apache and the Yaqui in the north, General Reyes had been rewarded with the post of governor of Nuevo Leon in 1885. Reyes had expanded his power base by siding with the powerful Carranza clan in Coahuila against the unpopular governor, who had permitted Americans to crowd out local cattlemen and farmers. With the support of the Carranzas, Reyes ensured the election of the governor of his choice in 1894, and then arranged for Venustiano Carranza to serve as senator. Despite Reyes' success in Coahuila, the Cientificos were ascendant. The post of vice president had been reintroduced in 1904 at the insistence of Limantour and was filled by Ramon Corral, an acceptable candidate to the Cientificos. Reyes had been forced out of the cabinet 2 years earlier, and they had switched much of the source of investment to Europe, mainly France and Britain. By 1909, they had 3 cabinet positions, 12 governors, 25 senators, and roughly half of the legislature. So why would they want anything to change? When Diaz reneged on his promise to not run, the anti-Cientificos and the Cientificos decided to fight for the vice presidency again in order to be well placed to succeed to the presidency when the dictator finally died. Reyes announced that he would run for vice president, but Diaz had begun to view the increasingly popular general as a threat. Diaz had previously balanced the Cientificos against the Reyistas, supporters of Reyes, but saw both of them as a threat by 1909. Even though Reyes had deliberately avoided leading a populist movement, was backed by the conservative middle class who was still loyal to Diaz, refused to make any criticism of Diaz, was only maneuvering for the vice presidency, and offered the best opportunity for a smooth transfer of power in the future, Diaz did not appreciate reminders of his mortality. So Reyes suddenly discovered a burning desire to study artillery in Europe. It is unknown if he feared the threat to his personal safety or simply understood that a presidential challenge would overturn the entire social order in Mexico. Why didn't Diaz simply prepare one of his children to succeed him? He had had 7 children with his first wife, who was also his niece, but he made no effort to prepare his only surviving son to be his successor. In addition, Diaz had a nephew, Felix Diaz Jr., the son of the dictator's brother, who had been killed during Diaz's 1872 revolt. Raised by his uncle, Felix never absorbed any of his charisma, but marriage to the daughter of a prominent family in Veracruz gave him a solid base in that city. Despite his family connection to the dictator, there were few political positions available for the ambitious Felix, since Diaz believed that stability was best ensured by keeping the same people in office forever. When Felix ran for governor in 1902, his uncle backed the establishment candidate against him, which simply increased the popularity of his nephew, since people genuinely wanted change. Refusing to back down, Diaz permitted a third candidate, a member of the Cientificos faction, to win the election. Irritated by his nephew's defiance, Diaz sent him into temporary exile as consul to Chile. A year and a half later, he was allowed to return to Mexico as head of the capital's police force. But he focused his energy on land speculation. Although Felix Diaz supported Reyes, he was initially unwilling to risk yet another exile by running for vice president, but the anti-Cientificos needed a standard bearer. However, he had waited too long, and there was another, more popular candidate, Francisco Madero Jr., a member of one of the 12 richest families in Mexico. The death of his mother when he was 28 had caused him to take interest in his fellow human beings, not just his own company. Madero had developed an interest in politics in 1903, after hearing first-hand accounts from friends and relatives of the shooting at Monterrey when agents of Governor Bernardo Reyes shot peaceful demonstrators backing his opponent. Although he lost the election for governor of Coahuila in 1905, Madero proved to be a determined campaigner. His book, The Presidential Succession of 1910, which criticized Diaz's regime, especially the exploitation of the poor by foreign interests, appeared in January 1909 and sold out immediately. I will take a moment to talk about the Madero clan. Taking advantage of the American Civil War to earn high profits on cotton from Texas, Madero's grandfather, Evaristo, then expanded into textile factories, copper mines, and refineries, despite competition from better-funded American concessionaires like the Guggenheims and the Rockefellers. Evaristo even served as governor of Coahuila from 1880 to 1884, but was replaced by a candidate loyal to Diaz. Still, the stability maintained during the Porfiriato enabled the family to prosper, acquiring one of the largest fortunes in Mexico by 1910. His son Francisco Madero proved to be a skilled businessman, making a fortune in mining and cattle, and he married into the wealthy Trevino family from Monterrey. In 1909, Madero formed the National Anti-Reelectionist Party, with himself as presidential candidate, and Francisco Vázquez Gómez, Diaz's personal doctor and a former supporter of Reyes, as his running mate. Aside from attracting the middle-class supporters of Reyes, Madero won the backing of the Carranza clan and the Maturana clan in Sonora. The 1907 Depression had affected the middle and upper classes, and the Madero family had seen the value of its holdings decrease sharply, which encouraged the family to support their earnest son's campaign. Not all of the family were optimistic. Madero's grandfather described the situation as the struggle of a microbe against an elephant. However, a number of factors were in Madero's favor. While rich clans controlled a number of Mexican states, they only admitted a few new members through marriage, preventing the upper and middle classes from entering the higher levels of the state and municipal authorities. Moreover, the upper and middle classes were frustrated by the blatant corruption that existed throughout Mexican officialdom, and they were denied any legitimate means of dealing with that frustration. Embarking on a nationwide tour, Madero routinely addressed crowds that numbered in the tens of thousands. Realizing that he might actually lose, Diaz simply arrested both Madero and 6,000 members of his new party, thus ensuring a smooth re-election. Believing that Madero was no longer a threat following the election, Diaz permitted him to leave prison, hopefully with more respect for his elders. As the leader of a middle-class movement, Madero was not a natural revolutionary, but he gradually came to accept that there was no other option if Diaz was to be defeated. Making his way across the border to Texas, he released the plan of San Luis Potosi that claimed that the election had been illegal. He then called for a revolution on November 20th, 1910, 6 weeks later. The plan was named after San Luis Potosi because Madero had been in that state on an election tour when he was arrested. When Madero issued his plan of San Luis Potosi, he tapped into a genuine desire for change, but he completely misunderstood the factors that drove that desire for change. While he recognized the frustration with the political process, the 2,500-word document did not even mention labor issues and devoted only a single paragraph to agrarian issues. Still, his national platform and deserved reputation for publicly running against Diaz and being arrested meant that he was the symbol of the revolution. Despite the huge popular support among the middle class, Madero does not appear to have gained many contacts among the middle class, especially labor leaders, and he had made no efforts to cultivate any during his tours of Mexico. Instead, he had just made speeches. Unfortunately, Dr. Gomez chose to not join Madero in the U.S. and refused to have his name mentioned in any plan for revolution. Gomez and his brother Emiliano only left Mexico in November when they realized that they would be suspected by the government regardless. When briefed on the plan, the doctor rightly dismissed it as amateurish and predicted correctly that the military would not embrace the revolution. Instead, he went to Washington to pursue further medical studies. Madero had accurately perceived that Mexico was ready for a revolution. His error was the belief that his middle-class backers could carry out a successful revolution. Gomez was proven right about the likelihood of failure. Diaz's police easily noticed purchases of weapons, tracked the buyers to the conspirators, and made mass arrests. Revolting on schedule on November 20th in an orderly fashion, Madero's middle-class supporters were easily crushed. After the first few revolutionaries were taken out and shot, Madero's followers adopted a more patient attitude towards regime change. Although a furious Diaz was convinced that Madero was receiving support from the United States, American corporate interests knew very well that they would not get a better deal under a new regime and had nothing to do with Madero. Diaz's belief was largely based on a misunderstanding. He was a president and refused to let revolutionaries operate openly, but could not comprehend that President William Taft had legal limitations that prevented him from interfering with Madero's activities during the time that he was based in the United States. It appeared that the revolution had been stillborn, but an uprising suddenly exploded in Chihuahua. In northern Mexico, a savage war to the death between the federal Mexican government and the Yaqui and the Apache had been going on for a generation. However, two key events occurred in 1885, the capture of Apache chief Geronimo by the American Army, and the completion of a railway link between Chihuahua and the rest of Mexico. The reduced Apache threat and improved transport links spurred economic growth in the state. In particular, Luis Terraza became rich due to his effectiveness in raising militias to ensure security, which attracted laborers for his estates. Realizing that it would be easier to co-opt regional strongmen like Terraza, Diaz permitted him to become governor in 1903. Villagers thought that Terraza was still their patron and would protect them. They were wrong. Since the Apache were no longer a serious threat, the family did not need the help of the village's militias. As governor, Terraza was able to take away the village's traditional communal land rights while bringing in foreign investment to fund the construction of railways and mines. Strikes were forbidden, and the tame press was not permitted to criticize his actions. Although Terraza wanted control, he also wanted to maintain his image as a man sympathetic to the people, so he granted enough of the villagers' petitions to preserve his image, while strengthening his hold on the state by removing rivals. There was little outrage at first, since the larger ranchers had followed Terraza's lead and permitted smaller ranchers to graze their cattle on their lands, which used to be communal land. Besides, How could the small ranchers be stopped since the area was huge? Until Terraza gave his son Alberto responsibility for ranch management, and Alberto introduced the practices he had studied in the US, in particular, barbed wire, which made fencing inexpensive. Having lost their free grazing, the small ranchers increasingly had to depend on salaried work in mines and ranches, so many crossed the border to work in Arizona and New Mexico. Still, the situation remained calm until Terraza handed over the governorship to his son-in-law, Enrique Creel, in 1904. And Creel quickly introduced stricter control to Chihuahua, ending elected mayors and backing more seizures of communal land by passing the Municipal Land Law of 1905. All municipal land had to be subdivided and sold, but the residents only had 15 days to file their claim and usually did not have the money for a lawyer. Happy to rule with an iron hand, Creel thought that his actions would benefit Mexico. Like many key decision makers in Mexico, he believed that progress depended on the introduction of technology and economy of scale in production, while eliminating wasteful inefficiency, in particular the overly generous grazing and water rights that had been granted to the villagers. Admittedly, some people in the state benefited from the new economic opportunities that came with the railway, but the majority did not. Letters of petition to the governor were ignored or answered with advice to seek justice in the courts. Expensive lawyers were hired, but the courts were corrupt and the villagers' appeals were rejected. Denied legal recourse, large numbers of tough, violent men all over the state were given two options: capitulate or start killing. Since the oligarchy in the state remained united, the villagers knew that revolt was futile, but a deep undercurrent of resentment bubbled in the region. The economic depression of 1908 hit all of Mexico, but Chihuahua was struck especially hard since the northern states were connected closely to the United States. Huge layoffs in mines and lumber yards threw thousands out of work, but the family farms that would have gotten them through the crisis had been taken away by the Terraza Creel faction. With so many people out of work, small-scale merchants went out of business, which broadened the social range of people dissatisfied with the government. In less than a decade, thousands of people in Chihuahua had fallen from middle class or secure working class into poverty. The problem still remained regional and was unlikely to have exploded into a full-scale revolt, but Madero's campaign against Diaz created a national crisis. That social anger needed leaders to direct it, and I will discuss those leaders, as well as the uprisings in other states, next episode. Thanks for listening.